Hello everyone and welcome to Spill Secret. Before we start, we ask you subscribe and leave a comment as to where you are listening from. Let's begin. The wind bit harder than usual as Jacob drove down Bone Road. The narrow, deserted path cut through a dense forest, where the trees seemed to grow too close, leaning in as if listening for secrets whispered by passing travelers. It was a road known for strange tales and unsettling encounters, though Jacob was the type who rarely paid attention to such things. Tonight, however, the feeling in his gut was undeniable. A prickling sense of something waiting just beyond the reach of his headlights. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes darting toward every shadow that flickered just outside his vision. Beside him, his younger brother, Leo, sat silently, staring out the window as if hypnotized by the passing trees. They hadn't spoken much since they'd left their childhood home earlier that evening, but Jacob didn't mind. Silence seemed safer somehow, like an unspoken agreement not to disturb the lurking darkness. "We're almost there," Jacob muttered, though he had no idea where there was. The plan was to spend a weekend in the old family cabin deep in the woods, a place they hadn't visited since they were kids. Their father had insisted they go, practically begged Jacob to take Leo and revisit the cabin before it was sold. He'd mentioned something about finding closure, but hadn't said much beyond that. And as much as Jacob had resisted, something in his father's eyes, the worry, the urgency, had made it impossible to refuse. Leo shifted in his seat, finally breaking his silence. "Do you remember anything about the cabin?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "Not much," Jacob replied, shrugging. "Just that it was old, dusty, and way out here in the middle of nowhere. We didn't even spend much time there, remember? Only a couple of summers, and then Dad stopped taking us." "Yeah," Leo said, a distant look in his eyes. "I just remember feeling weird there. Like there was something wrong with it." Jacob chuckled, though the sound felt forced. It was just a beat-up cabin. Nothing special. But as they continued down Bone Road, Jacob began to feel the weight of those memories pressing in on him, old fragments that he couldn't quite place. A faint memory of shadows moving along the cabin walls, of whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves. He shook his head, brushing it off as nothing more than childhood imagination. But the feeling persisted, a creeping unease that tightened his chest with every mile. After what felt like an eternity, the cabin finally came into view. Hidden among the trees, it stood as a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky, its wooden frame worn and crooked, as if the forest itself were trying to reclaim it. The cabin looked almost alive, its windows reflecting the faint glow of the headlights like staring eyes. Jacob swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep moving forward. He parked the car, and they climbed out, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles on the ground. The air was thick, almost stifling, and the silence was so complete that even their breathing sounded too loud. Jacob could feel Leo's unease growing beside him, and he forced a reassuring smile as they approached the door. "Come on," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "It's just a cabin. Nothing to be scared of." But as he turned the rusty doorknob and pushed the door open, he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside was waiting for them. Something that had been waiting a long time. The cabin's interior was just as Jacob remembered, though somehow more sinister than before. Shadows clung to the walls, cast by the single dim bulb that flickered as they entered. Dust coated every surface, and the air held a stale, damp smell, like something left to rot in the dark. Leo hesitated at the threshold, eyeing the room with a mixture of fear and fascination. Jacob watched his brother, sensing an unspoken tension between them, something that had been dormant for years but was now coming to the surface. They dropped their bags near the door, and Jacob moved to open a window, hoping the fresh air would make the place feel less suffocating. "It's been a while," he said, trying to sound casual. "Looks like Dad didn't bother to clean up." Leo gave a half-hearted nod, his eyes lingering on the old armchair in the corner. "Do you think he ever came back here? After? You know?" Jacob didn't answer right away. He knew what Leo was talking about. One of the few memories they shared was of their mother, sitting in that very armchair, her eyes wide and empty, her hands clutching the arms of the chair as if she were bracing herself against some invisible horror. She'd never explained what had happened, only that they had to leave immediately. They hadn't returned until now. "He probably did," Jacob replied, though he had his doubts. Their father had always been a superstitious man, prone to strange habits and cryptic warnings. But he'd never spoken about the cabin in detail, never mentioned the strange occurrences that had marked their last stay. He just didn't like to talk about it. Leo walked over to the chair, his hand hovering over the faded fabric as if testing for some lingering trace of their mother. "Do you remember that night?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The way she looked. Like she was seeing something that wasn't there." Jacob stiffened, a chill running down his spine. He'd tried to block that memory out, but now it came flooding back, vivid and unsettling. Their mother's terrified expression, her frantic words warning them to stay away from the trees. He hadn't understood it then, but standing here now, the words felt like a warning. "Let's not get carried away," Jacob said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "It was just an old house, probably got to her nerves, that's all." Leo looked at him with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "You always do this. Pretend it's nothing. But you're just as scared as I am, aren't you?" Jacob's jaw tightened, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to deny it, to tell Leo he was overreacting, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt charged, heavy, as if the cabin itself were holding its breath, waiting for them to make a move. Before he could respond, a soft creaking sound echoed through the room. Both brothers froze, their eyes darting toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The sound was faint, like footsteps on old wood, growing louder with each step. Jacob felt his throat tighten, his body instinctively tensing as he listened. "Did you hear that?" Leo whispered, his voice trembling. Jacob nodded, his hand reaching instinctively toward the flashlight in his pocket. He clicked it on, casting a narrow beam of light down the hallway. The shadows seemed to ripple in response, shifting and twisting as if alive. The creaking stopped, and for a brief moment, the silence was absolute, pressing down on them like a weight. Then, suddenly, the light flickered, and the beam dimmed, casting the hallway into darkness once more. Jacob cursed under his breath, tapping the flashlight, but it remained stubbornly dark. Leo moved closer, his hand gripping Jacob's arm, his eyes wide with fear. "Let's just go," Leo said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't need to stay here." But Jacob shook his head, the stubbornness that had always driven him kicking in. He wasn't about to let some creaky old cabin get the better of him. "No. We're staying. It's just the wind or the wood settling." He didn't believe his own words, and judging by the look on Leo's face, neither did he. But Jacob pushed forward, leading his brother into the darkness, his pulse pounding louder with every step. The hallway seemed to stretch longer than it should, the walls closing in, and the familiar creak of footsteps began again, this time louder, closer. They reached the end of the hall, and Jacob pushed open the door to the master bedroom. The room was dark and empty, but the scent hit him immediately, a faint, sickly sweet smell that he recognized but couldn't place. The bed was made, the covers pulled tight as if expecting someone, and in the far corner, something glinted in the moonlight filtering through the window. Jacob moved closer, his heart hammering in his chest as he knelt to examine the object. It was an old locket, tarnished and worn, the clasp broken, but the photo inside was unmistakable. It was a picture of their mother, her face etched with the same terror they'd seen that last night. And below her image, a faint line of text, barely visible, scratched into the metal, "Beware the Bone Road." Jacob's hand trembled as he held the locket, the eerie message burning itself into his mind. Beware the Bone Road. The words felt heavy, like a warning from the past, echoing back from a place that defied time and logic. Leo watched him with wide eyes, his face pale under the dim moonlight seeping through the grimy window. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence thick and stifling. Finally, Leo broke the spell, his voice low and unsteady. "What does it mean? Why would Mom have left that here?" Jacob couldn't answer. The memory of his mother's terror, her frantic warnings, came rushing back, making his skin prickle with unease. He wanted to dismiss it, to brush it off as some eerie coincidence, but the feeling of dread had rooted itself deep, gnawing at his mind like a splinter he couldn't dislodge. He tucked the locket into his pocket, forcing himself to keep a calm exterior for his brother's sake. "Look, it's probably nothing," he said, though his voice betrayed him. She was just scared. You know how people get when they're alone in places like this. But Leo wasn't convinced. He stepped back, his gaze fixed on the dark hallway they'd come from. Then why did she leave it behind, right here? It's like she wanted us to find it, like she's trying to tell us something. Jacob sighed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "This is just an old cabin, Leo. There's nothing here but shadows and creaky floors. We'll stay the night, and by tomorrow, we'll laugh about all of this." Just as he finished speaking, a sound echoed through the cabin, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was faint, like wind through the trees, but it was undeniably there, weaving its way through the walls. The sound sent chills down Jacob's spine, and he saw Leo's face go even paler, his eyes wide with terror. Did you hear that?" Leo whispered, his voice barely audible. Jacob swallowed hard, his throat dry. It's probably just the wind," he said, though the words felt hollow. The whisper grew louder, filling the room with a haunting melody of soft voices, each one blending into the next until they were indistinguishable. The voices seemed to call to them, urging them deeper into the cabin, pulling them toward some unseen presence. Unable to resist, Jacob took a step forward, his body moving as if guided by an invisible hand. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, each word slipping into his mind like tendrils of smoke. Leo grabbed his arm, his grip tight and desperate, his face etched with panic. "Jacob, we need to leave. Now." Jacob nodded, the urgency in his brother's voice snapping him back to reality. But as they turned to leave, the door at the end of the hallway slammed shut with a deafening bang, the sound reverberating through the cabin. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows shifting and twisting as if alive, and the whispering voices grew louder, their tone turning dark and menacing. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he lunged for the door, pulling at the handle with all his strength. But it wouldn't budge. The door seemed locked, as if held by some unseen force, trapping them within the suffocating walls of the cabin. Panic surged through him, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he looked to Leo, who was frantically pounding on the door. "Let us out!" Leo shouted, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. "Please, someone, let us out." The whispering reached a fever pitch, each word sinking into Jacob's mind like poison. Images flashed before his eyes, dark woods, twisted trees, shadowy figures lurking just beyond the light. He saw their mother, her face pale and gaunt, standing in the cabin's doorway, her eyes empty and soulless, her mouth moving in silent screams. The room grew colder, the air thick with the scent of decay. Jacob could barely breathe, his mind spiraling into darkness as the voices clawed at his thoughts. Desperate, he grabbed Leo's arm, his voice trembling. "We need to find another way out." Leo nodded, his face drawn and haunted, as if he too had glimpsed the horrors lurking within the cabin. They stumbled back into the hallway, their footsteps echoing through the narrow space. The walls seemed to close in tighter with each step, the shadows twisting and writhing as if alive, reaching out to touch them, to pull them back. They found themselves in the small kitchen, its counters covered in dust and cobwebs. A window above the sink offered a view of the moonlit forest beyond, but when Jacob tried to open it, he found it locked tight, the glass cold and unyielding beneath his fingers. The whispering grew louder, surrounding them, filling the room with a malevolent presence that seemed to breathe in the darkness. "Jacob," Leo whispered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of voices. "What? What are we going to do?" Jacob stared at the window, his mind racing. They were trapped, cornered by something he couldn't understand, something that defied logic and reason. And in that moment, he realized with chilling clarity that the cabin wasn't just a place, it was a prison, a living entity that had been waiting for them, calling them back. "We need to fight it," he said, though the words felt hollow. "We can't let it keep us here." But even as he spoke, he felt the darkness closing in, the cabin's whispers seeping into his mind, filling him with a terrible, sinking fear that they would never escape. Jacob felt his heartbeat thunder in his ears as he scanned the dimly lit kitchen, his eyes darting to the creaky cabinets and broken-down appliances. The room felt like it was swallowing them whole, pressing them towards some unseen horror lurking just beyond the walls. Every inch of his skin prickled with the certainty that they were not alone, and whatever shared the cabin with them was far from friendly. Leo was trembling, his eyes wide with desperation as he clung to Jacob's arm. "Jacob, please," he whispered, voice barely containing his panic. "There has to be another way out. We can't stay here. Not with it." Jacob's resolve wavered, the whispers echoing through his mind like a venomous chant, filling his thoughts with memories he couldn't place and fears he didn't understand. Shadows flickered across the walls, contorting into shapes that defied reason, faces, clawed hands, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right into his soul. Swallowing hard, Jacob grabbed his brother's hand, feeling a surge of protective instinct. "We're getting out of here, Leo," he said, forcing more confidence into his voice than he felt. "We'll find a way. I promise." They crept through the hallway, each creak of the floorboards amplified in the eerie silence. The door to the living room loomed ahead, but as they approached, the temperature dropped drastically, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping voices pressing against them from all sides. Every step felt like wading through thick, suffocating air. Jacob's breath fogged in front of him, and a chill settled deep in his bones. And then, he saw her. Standing at the edge of the room, half shrouded in shadow, was their mother. Her figure was gaunt, almost skeletal, and her once vibrant eyes were hollow and vacant, like someone who had seen things beyond human comprehension. She stared at them with an intensity that froze Jacob to the spot, her mouth moving as if she were trying to speak, but no sound escaped her lips. Jacob's hand tightened on Leo's as he whispered, "Mom." The apparition took a step forward, and Leo's grip on Jacob's arm tightened, his breathing fast and shallow. But instead of retreating, the brothers stood frozen, captivated by the silent plea in their mother's eyes. She reached a bony hand toward them, her fingers trembling as they hovered in the space between them. "Beware. The road," she whispered, her voice finally breaking through, barely audible yet filled with a profound sadness. It takes everything. Leaves nothing." Her words were fragmented, like an old, broken record struggling to play. Jacob felt a shiver run down his spine, a chilling realization settling over him. Their mother hadn't just been scared that night years ago, she had been warning them, desperately trying to save them from whatever lurked here. And now, they were trapped by the same force that had taken her. "What does it want?" Leo whispered, his voice quivering. Their mother's gaze shifted, her empty eyes locking onto Jacob's as she whispered, "To keep. To hold. Until there's nothing left." A gust of freezing air swept through the room, and their mother's figure faded, dissolving into the shadows as if she had never been there at all. The silence that followed was thick and oppressive, pressing down on them as Jacob processed her final words. Leo's hand shook as he pulled Jacob toward the door. "We need to get out of here, Jacob. Now." Jacob nodded, his mind racing. They stumbled toward the door, but just as they reached it, the entire cabin seemed to lurch, the walls groaning and creaking as if alive. The air grew impossibly dense, pressing in on them, suffocating them with its weight. Jacob reached for the doorknob, his fingers grazing it just as a powerful force slammed the door shut, nearly knocking him off his feet. "No!" Jacob shouted, pounding against the wood with all his strength. "Let us out." The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, each word piercing his mind like shards of glass. The shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around them, forming twisted, inhuman shapes that loomed closer with every second. Leo clung to him, his face pale with terror, as the cabin's malevolent presence bore down on them. Just when it seemed the darkness would consume them, Jacob remembered the locket. Desperation flooding his mind, he fumbled in his pocket and pulled it out, holding it up toward the encroaching shadows. The faint glint of metal seemed to repel them, the whispers momentarily faltering as if confused. With a surge of hope, Jacob thrust the locket forward. "You can't have us?" he yelled, his voice shaking but defiant. "We're leaving, and we're taking her with us." The shadows writhed, recoiling from the locket, their forms twisting and flickering like flames. The oppressive weight lifted slightly, and Jacob seized the moment, yanking the door open with all his strength. Light from the outside world spilled in, dispelling the shadows and sending a wave of fresh air through the cabin. Grabbing Leo's arm, Jacob pulled him through the doorway, and they stumbled out into the night. The cold air stung his lungs, filling him with a clarity he hadn't felt since they'd arrived. They sprinted toward the car, barely looking back, the whispers fading behind them as the cabin receded into the darkness. Once inside the car, Jacob jammed the key into the ignition, his hands trembling as he started the engine. Without a word, he peeled down the gravel path, the headlights illuminating the twisted trees that lined Bone Road. The cabin disappeared into the night, but Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching, waiting for another chance to ensnare them. As they sped away, Leo turned to Jacob, his face pale but resolute. "We're never coming back here. Ever." Jacob nodded, gripping the wheel with white knuckles. He didn't need to be told twice. The image of their mother's haunted face lingered in his mind, her warning etched into his thoughts. They had escaped, but he knew deep down that a part of them would always be trapped there, in that forsaken cabin, where shadows and whispers held secrets too dark to comprehend. And as they drove down Bone Road, leaving the cabin and its horrors behind, Jacob glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. For a brief moment, he thought he saw her there, his mother, standing alone in the dark, watching them go. But when he blinked, she was gone, leaving only the silence and the endless, winding road ahead. The old house in Evershade Hollow had a way of calling to people, but only a select few ever dared to listen. Liam Morgan knew this because he'd grown up with the stories whispered in the dead of night by his grandmother. She claimed the house at the edge of town held secrets darker than anyone wanted to know. Liam, now in his 30s, had brushed those stories off as wild tales meant to scare children. But when the Hollow's call began to haunt his dreams, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was waiting for him. He'd tried to ignore it, pushing the dreams down like an unwanted memory. But night after night, the same vision surfaced, the peeling paint, the cracked windows, the suffocating darkness that lingered just beyond the threshold. The details were vivid, too real to be a figment of his imagination. "You have to let it go, Liam," his girlfriend, Clara, had said when he confided in her. "It's just a story." Yet, even as she spoke, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, hesitation, maybe even fear. Liam wasn't the type to be spooked by old legends, but the dreams started taking a toll. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding as if he'd run a mile. Each time he closed his eyes, he'd see the house, feel its weight pressing down on him like a leaden blanket. It was becoming an obsession, one that gnawed at his sanity. One morning, after a particularly restless night, he decided he couldn't take it anymore. "I have to go there, Clara," he told her, his voice firm despite the exhaustion in his eyes. Clara stared at him, her brow furrowing. "Go where?" she asked, though the answer was already written on her face. She knew. She'd heard the stories just as he had. "Liam, this is... it's crazy. It's a haunted house myth, for God's sake." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying her calm exterior. But Liam's mind was set. "Maybe it's crazy," he replied, "but it feels like I'm being pulled there. Like the house is. I don't know, calling me." Reluctantly, Clara agreed to go with him, though he could see the worry etched in her features. They drove in silence, the autumn sky heavy with clouds that loomed over the trees like a grey veil. Evershade Hollow wasn't far from town, but as they neared the abandoned house, the air grew thick and unsettling. The road twisted and turned through gnarled woods, the skeletal branches reaching out like fingers desperate to cling to something living. When they arrived, Liam felt a chill seep into his bones. The house stood there, untouched by time yet somehow decaying from within. The windows were murky, black eyes watching them with a strange familiarity, as though it had been expecting them. Clara gripped his arm, her nails digging into his skin as she whispered, "This place. It's worse than I thought." But Liam barely heard her. He was transfixed, his gaze locked on the front door, which seemed to beckon him forward. They stood in silence, taking in the house's oppressive presence. Every step closer felt like wading through quicksand, as if the air itself was resisting them. The yard was overgrown, filled with weeds and twisted roots that snaked up toward the house's foundation. Liam felt something stir in his chest, a mixture of dread and excitement he couldn't quite understand. "Let's go inside," he said, almost in a trance, ignoring Clara's soft gasp of protest. He reached for the door, and as his fingers brushed the weathered wood, he felt a faint vibration. It was as though the house was alive, its pulse echoing faintly through his touch. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The creak of the hinges cut through the silence like a scream, and the darkness inside seemed to swallow the dim afternoon light. They stepped in, and the door swung shut behind them with a solid, unforgiving thud. Inside, the air was thick, damp with the smell of rot and something far more unsettling, a hint of decay, sharp and metallic. Clara covered her nose, her eyes wide with barely contained terror. Liam, let's just leave this place. It isn't right. But he barely registered her words. All he could hear was the faint, almost imperceptible whisper that drifted through the silence, weaving through the shadows like a deadly lullaby. The sound was faint, just on the edge of hearing, but he knew it was there, a murmur of words just beyond his grasp. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling despite his attempt to stay calm. Clara shook her head, but he saw the fear in her eyes, mirroring his own. They both knew, without speaking, that they'd crossed a line. There was no turning back. As they stood in the dim, stale air of the house, the weight of the hollow pressed down on them like an unseen hand, cold and suffocating. Liam's heart hammered as he strained to hear the faint whispers, but they were elusive, sliding just out of reach whenever he tried to focus. The air itself felt dense, thick with memories of the past, and shadows seemed to crawl across the walls, flickering like whispers made visible. Clara clung to his arm, her breaths coming in shallow, panicked gasps. "Liam," she whispered, "I have a bad feeling about this." Ignoring her, Liam took a few cautious steps forward, his eyes adjusting to the murky darkness. Every creak of the floorboards beneath them felt like a warning, a reminder that they weren't welcome here. His gaze fell on a staircase to their left, its wooden banister warped and splintered, leading up to a shadowy second floor. "I have to see what's up there," he murmured, more to himself than to Clara. The words sounded hollow, as though spoken by someone else. Clara's hand tightened around his arm. "No, Liam, this is insane. We shouldn't be here." Her voice was little more than a desperate whisper, a fragile plea against the pull that had overtaken him. She could feel it, too, the intangible thread that seemed to wrap around them both, drawing them deeper into the house. But even her fear couldn't overpower the strange compulsion in his mind. "Just a quick look," he said, forcing a reassuring smile that he didn't believe. "Then we'll go?" Reluctantly, Clara nodded, her face pale as they moved toward the stairs. Each step seemed to echo through the house, reverberating as if the walls were listening, waiting. The air grew colder with each step, and Liam noticed a faint pattern on the walls, intricate carvings etched into the wood, faded and worn by time. They were symbols he couldn't understand, twisting shapes that seemed to pulse with a quiet malevolence. "Do you see this?" he asked, brushing his fingers over the strange markings. They felt rough, almost like scars, as though the house itself bore wounds. Clara shuddered, barely glancing at the walls. "I don't want to look at anything in this place," she muttered. But Liam was mesmerized. The symbols felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain, as if they were trying to speak to him, to tell him something he had forgotten. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog that clouded his thoughts, but the sensation only grew stronger, more insistent. "It's like I know this place," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Clara looked at him, her expression a mix of confusion and fear. They reached the top of the stairs, and the corridor stretched out before them, dimly lit by cracks in the walls where thin slivers of pale light seeped through. The doors lining the hallway were closed, their wood warped and faded. One door, however, stood slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. Without waiting, Liam approached it, feeling Clara's hesitant steps behind him. He pushed the door open, revealing a small, dusty room bathed in eerie light. Inside, an old rocking chair sat in the corner, its wooden frame splintered and worn. It faced a single, cracked window, looking out onto the twisted trees that encircled the house. The room was otherwise empty, save for a faded rug in the center and a heavy silence that pressed down on them. Liam stepped inside, his gaze drawn to the chair. Something about it unsettled him deeply, as though he'd seen it before, but he couldn't remember when or where. Clara's voice broke the silence. Liam? Let's go. There's nothing here. She sounded close to tears, her face pale and drawn. But he couldn't move. His mind swam with fragmented images, blurred faces, voices calling his name, flashes of laughter twisted into screams. He clutched his head, trying to block out the assault of memories that weren't his. The rocking chair creaked, though neither of them had touched it. Slowly, it began to sway, back and forth, each movement a slow, haunting rhythm. Clara took a step back, her eyes wide with terror. Did you see that? She stammered, clutching the doorframe as if it might offer some protection. Liam couldn't answer, he was frozen, transfixed by the chair's steady movement. A voice, a soft, almost childlike whisper, filled the room, barely audible but unmistakable. Come back, it said, the words brushing against his mind like a cold breeze. Come back, Liam. His name spoken aloud jolted him from his trance. He staggered backward, his chest tight with fear. Clara grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. We need to leave, she insisted, her voice trembling. But as they turned to go, the door slammed shut, trapping them in the room. The whispers grew louder, filling the space with a cacophony of voices, overlapping and discordant. They spoke of loss, of despair, of lives claimed by the Hollow's relentless grip. Each voice carried a note of desperation, a longing that clawed at Liam's soul. He struggled to breathe, his vision blurring as the shadows in the room seemed to close in around them. The whispers merged into a single, sinister chant, words he didn't understand but felt deep in his bones. Clara's face twisted in terror, and she beat against the door, but it held firm, as if the house itself refused to let them go. They were trapped, caught in the Hollow's grasp, and Liam knew then that the house had been waiting for them all along. The room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a relentless, unseen force that pushed against their every movement. Liam felt it as a weight pressing down on him, clawing at his sanity, suffocating him. Clara's panic was palpable, she was pounding on the door, her fists leaving faint marks on the wood. Open, damn it! Let us out! She screamed, her voice cracking, raw with desperation. But the door held firm, unmoved by her terror. The house was silent once more, save for the eerie creak of the rocking chair swaying back and forth in its haunting rhythm. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the silence shattered. A voice whispered from the corner, soft and low, almost reverent. "Why have you come back?" it asked, the words curling around them like a fog, chilling and ethereal. Liam felt his heart skip, his blood running cold as he realized the voice wasn't coming from the shadows, it was coming from within him. It was as if the house had found a way into his mind, twisting his own thoughts to speak. He gripped Clara's hand, her skin clammy against his own, and tried to force the voice out of his head. I don't understand," Liam muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. But the voice continued, relentless, pressing on him with a terrible familiarity. "You remember, don't you?" it asked, coaxing, gentle, like a parent speaking to a lost child. Images began to flash through his mind again, faces he didn't recognize, a woman's soft laugh, a child's tiny hand reaching up toward his own. He stumbled back, clutching his head as the memories clawed their way to the surface, demanding to be seen. Clara shook him, her voice laced with fear. "Liam? Snap out of it!" she cried, but he was slipping further, sinking into the memories that weren't his yet felt as real as his own. He saw a family, his family, he realized, though he had no recollection of them. A wife, a child, a life he had lived. Or had he? He felt the warmth of a love long forgotten, the hollow ache of loss, the darkness that had followed. The woman in his vision held him close, whispering something he couldn't quite hear, her face twisted with sorrow. And then he saw it, the house, looming over him like a predator. In his mind, he was standing at the front door, his wife and child clinging to him, their eyes wide with terror. They were trapped, just as he and Clara were now, and the house had taken them, devoured them, leaving nothing behind but whispers. The realization struck him like a blow, and he staggered, his breathing shallow. This place. It's feeding off us, he gasped, the weight of the truth settling over him. Clara looked at him, confusion and fear battling in her gaze. What do you mean? She whispered, clutching his arm as though he were the only solid thing left in a world gone mad. But he could barely explain it himself. The memories, the house, the whispers, they were all connected, woven together in a tapestry of despair and loss. I think I've been here before, he murmured, his voice thick with dread. Or a part of me has. The rocking chair stopped suddenly, its creaking silence a stark contrast to the rising terror in the room. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows pressing tighter, as if the house was listening, waiting for him to remember. And then the whisper returned, louder, more insistent. You can't leave, Liam? Not this time? The words wrapped around him, squeezing the air from his lungs. He felt the floor shift beneath him, as though the house was alive, moving, twisting itself to keep them inside. Clara pulled him toward the door, her hand slipping in his sweat-dampened grasp. We have to get out, Liam? Now. She urged, her voice a frantic plea. Together, they threw their weight against the door, again and again, but it held fast, resisting their every effort. The whispers grew louder, overlapping voices filled with anguish, sorrow, and a deep, unyielding hunger. They spoke of lives lost, of dreams shattered, of souls bound to the hollow for eternity. And then, in a moment of clarity, Liam understood. The house didn't just want them, it needed them. It fed on fear, on despair, on the broken fragments of those who entered its walls. It was a parasite, a twisted, living entity sustained by the souls it claimed. And now it was reaching for them, sinking its claws into their minds, their hearts, dragging them deeper into its dark embrace. It's not going to let us leave, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers that surrounded them. Clara's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. No. No, Liam, we can't stay here. We have to find a way out. But even as she spoke, he saw the truth dawning in her eyes. The house had them, just as it had claimed countless others before. They were trapped, ensnared in its web of despair, and there was no escape. Liam felt the weight of the house pressing on him, like icy fingers digging into his spine. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, as if the entire structure were a lung inhaling their fear. Clara was sobbing, her face pale and streaked with tears as she clutched his hand. He tried to muster strength, to think of a way out, but the voice in his head was growing louder, drowning out his thoughts, whispering promises of things he could not fully understand. The room suddenly shifted, stretching out before them, twisting into something unfamiliar. The doorway elongated, stretching farther and farther away, transforming into a hallway lined with mirrors. Each mirror reflected not their current, terrified selves, but distorted, nightmarish versions of them, gaunt, hollow-eyed, staring back with haunted expressions. Liam? What is this? Clara whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at her reflection, seeing herself as though she'd been trapped in the house for decades, worn down and broken. A guttural scream echoed from down the hallway, chilling them both to the core. The mirrors rattled in their frames, distorting the reflections further. Liam's heart raced as he recognized the voice, a twisted, agonized version of his own. The scream faded into a whisper that seemed to slip directly into his mind. You're part of the hollow now, Liam. You've always been here. He staggered back, clutching his head, fighting to block out the voice, but it clawed at his mind, digging up memories he'd never lived but felt bound to all the same. Clara gripped his shoulders, pulling him back to reality. Don't listen to it, Liam. We're real, we're here. We're not trapped. But even as she spoke, he could see the doubt in her eyes. The house was working its way into her, twisting her fears, feeding off her despair. She closed her eyes, pressing her palms to her temples, trying to resist the pull. I can feel it, Liam. It's taking something from me. He took a shuddering breath, trying to steady himself. We need to find something, some way to break its hold, he said, his voice barely a whisper. His gaze fell to the mirrors again, each one a portal into a different version of themselves, each one reflecting another moment of despair. His hands trembled as he reached for Clara's, gripping her tightly, as if holding onto her would keep them both anchored. We're getting out of here, together. With a shared determination, they began moving down the hallway, each step bringing them closer to the faint glow at the end. But with every step, the walls seemed to close in, the air thickening, the whispers growing louder, more urgent. The mirrors on either side of them showed them aging, decaying, their skin turning pale and cracked, their eyes hollow. It was as if the house was showing them their future, the inevitable fate that awaited those who dared enter. They reached the end of the hallway, finding themselves before a door that pulsed with a faint, eerie glow. Liam felt an instinctual pull toward it, sensing that beyond it lay the heart of the hollow, the source of the darkness that held them captive. Clara's hand tightened in his, her breath ragged as she shook her head. Liam, I don't want to go in there. Please. Let's find another way. But Liam knew there was no other way. The house had led them here, and there was no turning back. Whatever's on the other side. We face it together, he said, forcing himself to believe the words. Slowly, he pushed open the door, and they stepped into a cavernous room bathed in shadows. At the center of the room stood the rocking chair from earlier, its wood dark and polished, almost as if it were waiting for them. As they approached, the whispers coalesced, forming a single voice that filled the room. You came to me, Liam? You came willingly. He shivered, recognizing the voice as his own, but twisted, warped by an eternity of suffering. The room shifted, and he saw himself standing by the chair, but this version of him was older, broken, his eyes hollow, his expression twisted by years of torment. You belong to the hollow now. Your soul is mine. Clara screamed, pulling him back, her voice filled with raw terror. No. You're not taking him. But the other Liam only smiled, a dark, haunting smile, filled with a hunger that defied understanding. There's no escape, Clara. He's been mine since the beginning. With a desperate cry, she grabbed Liam's hand, dragging him back toward the door, but the house resisted, pulling them deeper, its walls twisting and shifting to trap them. Summoning every ounce of strength, Liam gripped her hand, forcing himself to speak. We're leaving, he said, his voice filled with a determination that felt foreign in the oppressive darkness. The house shuddered, the walls groaning as if in protest, but he pushed forward, defying the pull, dragging Clara with him. With each step, he felt the grip of the hollow weakening, its hold slipping as they moved closer to the doorway. Just as they reached the threshold, a powerful force slammed into them, trying to pull them back. Liam clung to Clara, his heart pounding as he fought against the unseen hands dragging them down. And then, with a final surge of will, they broke free, stumbling out of the house and into the cold, grey dawn. They collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, the weight of the hollow lifting as the house receded into silence. The door creaked shut behind them, the whispers fading into the shadows. They lay there, holding each other, feeling the warmth of the sun as it rose over the trees. Liam glanced back at the house, a dark silhouette against the morning sky, knowing that its darkness would linger with them forever. But they had escaped, leaving the Hollow's whispers behind. The fog always came down heavy on Crow's Nest. It was as if the place were cursed, forever swathed in a grey, ghostly blanket that kept the sun at bay and the truth hidden. For most folks, Crow's Nest was nothing more than a backwater town on the edge of nowhere. But for Clara Thompson, it was the last stop on her journey to find answers about her missing brother, Samuel. She hadn't been back since high school, but something about the town's oppressive atmosphere hadn't changed. The air was thick, carrying a dampness that clung to her clothes and seemed to settle in her bones. Clara drove her old Honda Civic through the winding roads, feeling the trees lean in like silent sentinels, watching her progress. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. Her parents had long since moved out, and her friends from high school had scattered, most eager to forget whatever horrors they'd experienced in the gloomy town. But Clara couldn't forget. Not when Samuel had disappeared in that very fog one September night, leaving behind only his backpack and a broken flashlight at the edge of the woods. "Come on, Sam," Clara murmured, gripping the steering wheel as the fog grew thicker, visibility shrinking to mere feet. "Where did you go?" Her voice was swallowed up by the quiet, and she felt a chill run down her spine. She had to keep reminding herself that she was here for answers. She'd scoured every police report, every faded newspaper clipping she could find, but all they offered were dead ends and whispered rumors. Now, she was back to face whatever secrets Crow's Nest had been hiding. As she entered the town, the first thing that struck her was how little had changed. The gas station on Main Street looked as decrepit as ever, with its peeling paint and flickering neon sign. The grocery store, once bustling with familiar faces, was boarded up, the windows dark and uninviting. Even the houses seemed deserted, their windows blank and lifeless. A creeping sense of unease settled over her as she drove toward the house she'd grown up in. Clara hadn't seen it in years, but the sight of it, sitting alone on the edge of town, brought back a flood of memories, both comforting and chilling. She parked in the gravel driveway, the crunching of stones the only sound in the suffocating silence. The house loomed above her, dark and foreboding, its paint peeling in long strips. Clara remembered her mother always complaining about the dampness, how it ate away at everything. Now, it seemed the fog had claimed the house entirely, the wood rotting, the windows clouded over. As she reached for her bag, she noticed a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, a shadow darting just beyond her line of sight. "Hello," she called, her voice wavering. But there was no answer, only the quiet press of the fog and the whispering trees. Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell hit her immediately, a stale, earthy odor that reminded her of wet leaves and old newspapers. The memories came rushing back, each room bringing her closer to the night Samuel vanished. She made her way to the living room, her eyes scanning the walls, the faded wallpaper peeling away in places. Then, she saw it. Her breath hitched. On the wall, etched faintly into the plaster, was a phrase she hadn't noticed before: "They watch from the fog." Clara's heart pounded as she reached out to touch it, her fingers tracing the jagged lines of each letter. Who had carved it, and when? She took a step back, her mind racing, questions bubbling up faster than she could process them. Before she could think too much about it, a creak echoed from upstairs. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but Clara knew this house well enough to recognize the sound. Her old bedroom was directly above, the one place where she and Samuel had spent countless nights, sharing ghost stories and daring each other to brave the foggy woods. She hadn't planned to go up there, but something compelled her forward. The floorboards groaned under her weight as she climbed the stairs, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. The fog pressed against the windows, thicker than ever, as if trying to break through. As she reached the landing, the door to her bedroom stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness within. Holding her breath, Clara pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was just as she'd left it, a faded quilt on the bed, posters of rock bands peeling from the walls. But on the floor, right in the middle of the room, was something that didn't belong, Samuel's backpack, untouched, as if he'd left it there only yesterday. Clara knelt down, her fingers brushing against the dusty fabric of Samuel's backpack. The sight of it here, in the exact spot where she remembered it last, sent a shiver through her. She unzipped the bag slowly, half expecting it to be empty, but as the zipper gave way, she saw his old notebook inside, worn and battered. She pulled it out, feeling the weight of years between her fingers, each page a possible glimpse into Samuel's final days before he vanished into the fog. She flipped open the cover, her eyes scanning the familiar scrawl of his handwriting. The notebook was filled with half-finished drawings and strange symbols she didn't recognize. But what caught her attention were the words scrawled repeatedly across several pages, written with an urgency that nearly tore through the paper, "The Watchers are here." Clara felt a chill as she read it, the words reverberating in her mind like a whispered warning. Who were the Watchers, and why had her brother been so obsessed with them? Suddenly, the room felt colder. The fog outside pressed harder against the window, making it seem like the whole house was sinking into a grey void. She heard a noise, a soft scratching, almost like fingernails scraping against glass. Clara's head whipped around, her heart hammering as she scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed movement outside the window. Just a shadow, barely visible through the fog, but there was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was standing just beyond the glass. Clara took a cautious step forward, her eyes fixed on the shadow. It was tall and thin, with an unnatural stillness, as if it were carved from the fog itself. She swallowed, trying to convince herself it was just a trick of the light. But then the shadow moved, sliding silently away into the thick fog, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Clara's breath came out in a shaky exhale. She had the sudden urge to leave, to run as far from this place as possible, but something held her there, an invisible tether pulling her toward answers she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Steeling herself, she returned her attention to the notebook. Flipping through the pages, she found more frantic scrawls, cryptic phrases she didn't understand, and sketches of twisted trees and thick fog with hollow-eyed figures hidden among the shadows. One page in particular caught her eye, with a hastily drawn map that looked like the woods surrounding Crow's Nest. A red X marked a spot deep within the trees, far beyond any path she remembered. Next to it, he had scribbled, "Find the clearing before they find you." Clara clenched the notebook, a strange determination hardening inside her. Whatever secrets her brother had uncovered, he had left clues for a reason. She was certain now that he had gone to that clearing, hoping to discover the truth about these so-called Watchers. And if she wanted to know what had happened to him, she'd have to follow his footsteps. She pocketed the notebook, grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen, and steeled herself. The sun had already set, and the fog had thickened, but she knew she couldn't wait until morning. Every instinct screamed for her to leave, to flee, but her heart wouldn't allow it. Just as she opened the front door, a familiar voice echoed from behind her. "You shouldn't go out there alone, Clara." She spun around, her heart leaping. It was Dan, her childhood friend and the last person she'd expected to see in Crow's Nest. He looked almost exactly the same, tall, scruffy, with a weariness that seemed out of place on his otherwise youthful face. "Dan! What are you doing here?" she asked, relief mixing with confusion. "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her flashlight and the notebook in her hand. "You know what's out there, don't you?" His tone was filled with a seriousness she didn't remember from their carefree days. Clara hesitated, unsure how much she wanted to share. But something about Dan's expression told her he already knew more than he was letting on. "Samuel. He left clues," she said finally. "I think he went to the clearing in the woods. I need to know what happened to him." Dan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I was afraid you'd say that. Listen, Clara, if you're set on going, you're not going alone. The woods. They're different now. Darker. Whatever's out there, it's been watching, waiting." His words sent a ripple of fear through her, but Clara set her jaw, determined not to let it stop her. "Then let's go. Together." The fog swallowed Clara and Dan as they ventured into the woods, the thick silence broken only by the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. Their flashlights barely pierced the gloom, the beams struggling against the heavy mist that hung like a curtain around them. Every shadow seemed to shift and breathe, as if the trees themselves were watching their progress. Clara tightened her grip on Samuel's notebook, her fingers tracing the hastily drawn map as she tried to lead them toward the clearing. "So, you never told me why you came back," Clara whispered, her voice hushed as if the fog itself could hear them. Dan kept his gaze fixed ahead, his face taut with unease. "I never really left," he admitted, his voice low. "After Samuel disappeared, something kept me here. I tried to leave a few times, but every time I'd get as far as the highway, I'd turn around. It's like the town wouldn't let me go." Clara felt a pang of sympathy mixed with fear. She knew exactly what he meant. Crow's Nest had a way of holding on to people, its shadow stretching far beyond its borders. "I should have come back sooner," she murmured, guilt gnawing at her. "Maybe if I'd been here, I could have stopped him from going out that night." Dan shook his head, his expression softening. "It wouldn't have mattered." Samuel was determined. He believed he was onto something. Something big. "What did he find?" Clara asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Dan hesitated, his eyes darting around the mist-shrouded trees. "He called them the Watchers. Said they were some kind of ancient force, bound to this place. He thought they were connected to the fog, that they could move through it, watching people without being seen. I thought he was just, obsessed. But then he vanished." They walked in silence for a few moments, Clara absorbing his words. Her brother's disappearance had always felt like a puzzle with missing pieces, but hearing Dan's account made it feel like those pieces were finally snapping into place. "Do you believe it now?" she asked, glancing over at him. Dan's jaw tightened, and he nodded slowly. "I've seen things. Shadows in the fog, figures that disappear the moment you look directly at them. It's real, Clara." Whatever he was looking for, it found him. They reached a small stream, the water trickling through the rocks like a murmur in the stillness. Clara checked the map, her heart pounding as she realized they were close. She glanced up, the trees looming around them, their branches twisting like skeletal arms. The fog had grown thicker, pressing in on all sides, and the air was filled with a strange stillness, as if the forest were holding its breath. "We're almost there," she whispered, feeling a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. They pushed forward, the path narrowing as they approached the clearing. The silence grew heavier, oppressive, and Clara's skin prickled with the sense that they were not alone. She caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye, a dark figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. Her breath caught in her throat, and she stopped, clutching Dan's arm. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dan nodded, his face pale. "Yeah. I see it." The figure stood motionless, shrouded in fog, its form barely discernible. Clara felt a wave of cold dread wash over her, her instincts screaming at her to turn and run. But before she could move, the figure raised a hand, beckoning them forward with a slow, deliberate motion. She exchanged a terrified glance with Dan, her heart pounding, but they both knew they couldn't turn back now. Taking a shaky breath, Clara stepped forward, her flashlight flickering as she entered the clearing. The figure vanished as she drew closer, melting into the fog like smoke. In the center of the clearing, she saw something that made her blood run cold, a circle of stones arranged with a careful precision, and within it, a small wooden box, its surface etched with strange symbols. Clara knelt beside it, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch it. "Don't," Dan warned, his voice tight with fear. "I've seen that symbol before. Samuel drew it in his notebook. Said it was a seal, a way to keep the Watchers at bay." Clara hesitated, her hand hovering over the box. She knew she shouldn't open it, but the pull was irresistible, a compulsion that gnawed at her like an itch she couldn't scratch. Before she could stop herself, her fingers closed around the lid, and she lifted it open. Inside was a small, weathered journal, bound in leather and covered in the same strange symbols that decorated the box. She opened it, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. The handwriting was different from Samuel's, ancient and spidery, but she could still make out the words, "They come with the fog, drawn to fear and despair. Only the seal holds them at bay. To break it is to welcome them." Clara's stomach dropped, her mind racing as she realized the gravity of what she'd just done. She looked up at Dan, panic flaring in her chest. "We have to leave. Now." But as she stood, the fog around the clearing began to shift, thickening and coiling like a living thing. Shadows emerged from the mist, their hollow eyes fixed on her, watching her with a hunger that made her blood run cold. Clara stumbled back, her heart pounding as the Watchers closed in, their forms twisting and shifting in the fog. They were trapped. Clara's heart pounded as the fog thickened, pressing in from all sides, leaving her and Dan surrounded by ghostly figures, their hollow eyes unblinking and locked onto her. The Watchers moved with an unnatural fluidity, their bodies shifting and twisting as if made from the very mist itself. Clara felt paralyzed, her feet rooted to the spot, a cold dread seizing her. She clutched the ancient journal in her hands, its fragile pages trembling as she tried to remember the words she'd just read, "Only the seal holds them at bay." "Clara," Dan whispered, his voice barely holding back the panic. "We need to do something. Now." Clara glanced around, her mind racing. She knew that opening the box had somehow broken the seal that kept these entities at bay. But could she reverse it? Her fingers fumbled over the journal's pages, desperate for any clue, anything that might save them. Then, as her eyes skimmed the ancient text, she found a passage written in a trembling hand, a warning and an instruction all in one: to close the veil, one must burn what was disturbed and leave the circle untouched. "We have to burn the box," she said, her voice shaking. "It's the only way to close the seal and drive them back." She looked to Dan, hoping he might have something to start a fire with. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a lighter, his hand trembling as he flicked it to life. Clara knelt by the wooden box, her fingers brushing over the strange symbols etched into the surface one last time before she placed it in the center of the circle. The flames caught slowly at first, licking the edges of the wood, and then flared, consuming the box with an intensity that surprised her. The fire cast an eerie glow across the clearing, illuminating the faces of the Watchers, their expressions twisted in rage and hunger. They recoiled, their forms writhing and contorting as the flames grew higher, the light pushing back the fog and casting deep shadows across their hollowed eyes. As the box burned, a high-pitched, keening sound filled the air, like the wail of something ancient and furious. Clara felt it vibrate through her bones, an agonizing sound that seemed to scrape against her very soul. She gritted her teeth, willing herself to stay focused, to keep her gaze on the flames and not let fear take hold. Beside her, Dan clutched her shoulder, his knuckles white with tension as he tried to hold his ground against the pressing darkness. But just when she thought they might be safe, one of the watchers broke through, its form solidifying as it lunged toward her with a speed that defied the misty world it came from. Clara stumbled back, a scream tearing from her throat, and Dan sprang into action, positioning himself between her and the shadowy figure. The watcher paused, its hollow eyes narrowing, as if contemplating this new obstacle. Then, without warning, it reached out, its shadowy fingers curling around Dan's arm. "Dan!" Clara cried, watching in horror as the fog seemed to seep into his skin, draining the color from his face. His eyes glazed over, his mouth opening in a silent scream as the watcher began to merge with him, drawing him deeper into the fog. Clara felt her heart shatter, a helpless rage boiling inside her. She wouldn't let them take him, not like they took Samuel. Not without a fight. In a surge of adrenaline, she grabbed the journal, flipping to the last page, where a single sentence was scrawled in Samuel's handwriting: "Fear feeds them, defiance weakens them." The words struck her like a lightning bolt. Clara clenched her fists, feeling the terror within her morph into a fierce resolve. She stared directly at the watcher, her voice steady as she shouted, "You don't own us? You can't take us." To her astonishment, the watcher recoiled, its grip on Dan loosening. The fog around them began to waver, as if struggling to hold its form against her defiance. Dan collapsed to his knees, gasping for air as the watcher's shadowy form dissolved back into the mist, its hollow eyes narrowing in frustration. Clara took his arm, helping him to his feet as the fire in the circle continued to burn, the flames pushing back the last of the watchers. With a final, defiant glare at the mist, Clara and Dan stepped out of the clearing, their bodies trembling but unbroken. The fog around them began to thin, receding as they walked back through the forest. The weight lifted, the suffocating silence replaced by the soft sounds of the night. Clara felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, mingled with a bittersweet ache. She knew Samuel was gone, but in a way, he'd given her the strength to survive, to face the darkness that had haunted Crow's Nest for so long. As they reached the edge of the woods, Clara glanced back one last time. The clearing was empty now, the circle of stones barely visible in the fading fog. But she felt certain the watchers were still there, hidden in the mist, waiting. She squeezed Dan's hand, a quiet promise to herself never to return to the cursed woods. They had defied the darkness, but she knew Crow's Nest would always hold its secrets, lurking in the shadows, waiting for those foolish enough to seek them. Thank you for listening. Be sure to check out our channel for more stories.